We've got the basics for our ship and enemies set up, but we want to be able to allow our ship to fire lasers at the enemy. So we're going to create a new scene, and we're going to be creating the bullet scene for this ship. Now, generally you might use an area 2D for this, and you could detect overlap that way. But just for fun, I decided I wanted to use a rigid body instead, and that way I could teach you about rigid bodies, because rigid body will work in this scenario as well. Sometimes a node will work in different scenarios, and there's trade-offs you get for both of them. I do think an area 2D would be slightly better for this scenario, because we don't need all of the extra functionality that exists with rigid bodies, so we're kind of getting a lot of extra baggage with this, but it's for the sake of learning, so let's do that. We'll create a new custom node, and you can search up rigid body, and we'll want to do rigid body 2D, and there's a lot of different body type nodes. You can see we've got kinematic and static and rigid, and we'll be talking about kinematic and static bodies in later lectures, but now is a good time to cover rigid bodies. So let's create this. We'll call it bullet, and similar to when we create an area, you can see we're getting an error message here that we need a shape assigned to this rigid body. So let's first attach a sprite, and we'll use our bullet.png. Oops, didn't quite get it there. There we go. And we'll attach a collision shape. We'll just use a square. So come to shape, new rectangle shape. We can, we've got snap selected, so let's turn on pixel snap, turn off snap to grid. We can drag this down, make it about that size. That seems like a good size for the collisions. And we'll just call this collision and save. Now if we run this scene, our bullet is actually going to fall. And this is what I was talking about, where we have a little bit of extra functionality that comes with rigid bodies. Rigid bodies have physics with them. So this is why an area 2D would be better for this, but we will use it anyways. And if we come into our gravity scale, we'll set that to 1. And now our rigid body will no longer, let's just do run the scene. Now our rigid body will no longer fall. And we can apply some forces to it. You can see we've got a linear velocity, so we're going to use this. We'll have a linear velocity of 200 in the x direction. If we run our scene, our bullet will fire off to the left. Perfect. Now that we've done that, we're going to learn how to instance a scene in code. And so before we've been instancing scenes like this inside of our game room, right? And we can do that as well here. So we could instance the bullet right there. But we want to be able to instance a bullet when the player presses a button. And so we need to learn how to do that in code. So let's come into our ship. And inside of our ship, we're going to, inside of the script here, we're going to get a reference to the bullet. And you can use the const, you can store in a const. We'll just call it bullet. And then preload. And then you have to do the path to the bullet scene. Make sure you don't do the bullet.png, but the bullet scene. This gives our ship access to the bullet scene inside of code. And this scene is called a packed scene. So that's what this is going to store. It's going to store a packed scene, and you can instance packed scenes. And we're going to create a new function here. Called fire bullet. So inside this function, we'll want to instance our bullet in a similar way that we press this button up here to instance it in the scene. We need to call a function called instance and store that in a variable. So we'll say var bullet equals bullet dot instance. So I usually use a naming convention of lowercase for instances and then uppercase for the pack scene. So you can see I've got an uppercase here. That way I know that this isn't an instance of the scene, it's the packed scene itself. And then for each instance that I create, I make it lowercase like this. Once we've done that, we actually need to add this scene as a child of another node, right? And the easiest way to do this is to get the root node of the scene. And there's a function for that. We can do var, I usually call it the main node, equals get tree dot current scene. This will get us the world node, basically, the very root node of the scene. Once we've gotten that, we can add the bullet as a child of that. So main dot add child bullet, and make sure you do the lowercase here because we're adding the instance of the scene that we've made as a child of the main scene. Now the last thing we need to do is set the position of the bullet because its position hasn't been set. So those are there's three steps. So let's set the position here. We'll say bullet dot global position. And we'll use global position just to be sure. Technically we could use position here, but we'll use the global position just to be sure that we're getting the position globally and not relative to its parent. Global position equals global position. So this is setting the bullet's global position to the ship's global position, right? Then we'll save. So those are the three steps when you're instancing a scene from code. You need to call instance on the pack scene, store it in a variable like this, so call instance. Then you need to add it as a child of another node, and then you need to set its position. Technically, you don't always have to set its position because maybe you want it just at 0, 0, because I think that's where it defaults to. But in this case, we do want to set its position. So now we need to get input from the player and then call this function. If input.isAction just pressed. So now we're going to be using just pressed instead of pressed, right? Because we don't want to be able to hold this down. We want to make them press it over and over. And we'll use UI accept, which I think counts as both space and enter. And then we'll call our function fire bullet like this. And if we run the game, you can see we can now fire bullets from the ship's position. And they're being drawn under the ship. So in this situation, you can actually watch what's happening. If we come over here and we click remote over here, this will show us the scene that is currently in the game, or the scene that is currently running. So we can see our enemies, and if I fire, you can see the bullet gets created. As I create new bullets, it creates more and more bullets. You can see our enemies are still in this scene as well, even though they went off the screen. So we're going to be doing something about that in later lectures, but you can even click on these, see their children, and get the properties. Like you can see the linear velocity here. There must be a dampening on these bullets because they're actually slowing down. So that's funny, but that's part of what happens when you get the extra physics associated with them, but we'll need to do something about the fact that we're going to have some huge memory issues if we don't get rid of these bullets when they go outside the scene. So that's convenient to know too when you're debugging. You can click on remote up here. Obviously that option isn't available when the game isn't running, but if it is running, you can check the remote scene. And that's going to be it for this lecture. Hopefully you enjoyed it and learned something, and I will see you all in the next one.